Welcome back to True Crime with Emma Kenny, otherwise known as Kenny's Crime Cult by some. I'm owning it now. I'm just owning it. If you want to be part of that cult, you just need to subscribe because I release content every Sunday, sometimes in between when I can, but genuinely every single Sunday there will be a premiere of a new case. Always disturbing. Know that if you're tuning in here that you are going to be hearing about some horrific murders, but also analysing what creates them and ideally trying to dissect the elements that led to the horror that ensued. And today I'm going to be talking about one of the most heinous individuals that I think I've ever studied. I do have a real trigger point. I find murder per se obviously unpalatable, and I certainly find serial killings terrifying. And even though any death is one too many, particularly at the hands of such horror, I have a real problem when it comes down to children who are murdered. I find child murderers beyond contempt because children are so innocent, they're so naive. And for most of us, when you see a child, they wouldn't even need to be your child. You'd just be happy to throw yourself in front of a car if you knew you were going to protect that stranger's child. That's that natural inclination that most of us have. And even though there are studies at the moment, and there's some really interesting studies, particularly in the States, on a more neuroscientific level, where they're looking at the wiring of the brain of child molesters, and where the ordinary human, the typical human, will have an area of our brain where the neural pathways basically lead to child equals protection. So that's the normal wiring of the brain. I see a kid, want to protect it. Child molesters actually have a rewiring or a disconnection between and a wiring to a particular area of the brain, which is sexual interest. So it's an evolving, and it's not absolutely confirmed, but there's an evolving theory that child molesters actually have a faulty wiring, and therefore when they see a baby or a child, they have sexual urges. Remember though, having said that, urges exist in all of us. Admit it. How many times in your life have you wanted to punch your boss? You know, we have urges. We get let down by a friend and we think about things that we might like to do that would make their life difficult. They're urges, right? You don't act on them. That's the key with crime. We all think of things. I've thought about things in my head, definitely in the last year. I've had images in my head of what I'd like to do with certain people, but they're not things that you act on, right? So even if the wiring of the brain in this context is true, it still isn't going to give any license to people to go out and molest children. And if you are triggered by tales of child molestation, and if you are triggered by child death at the hands of horrific killers, this is not a crime case to listen to because it's horrific. So it's about a man called Robert Black. He was basically a Scottish serial killer. He was also a child molester. Throughout his history of crime, he was convicted of kidnap, rape, torture, abduction, assault, and essentially he was brought to justice for the murder of 4 girls. And they were only aged between 5 and 11 years of age, these little girls. And I think that the chances are that he committed a huge amount of other murders. I can't prove it, but as we go through the case and we hear about the kind of work that he did, but also the brutality, the way he committed the crimes, the way he treated the bodies of his victims, not for 1 minute do I imagine that there aren't bodies littered in other parts of the country of missing children that we just don't know about. The killings that he committed happened between 1981 and 1986, all in the United Kingdom. And of course, whilst he is brought to justice on this, I genuinely feel, as noted, that the chances are it wasn't just UK crimes, and the chances are that he murdered people all over Europe. So who was Robert Black? Well, he didn't have an easy childhood, I'll be honest with you. He was born in a place called Grangemouth in Stirlingshire, and that was in 1947. He was an illegitimate child of a woman called Jessie Black, and his father just wasn't known. They don't know who he was. Now, when he was first born, his mother, she was young. She didn't want him. She wanted to have him adopted because her plan was to go to Australia. That was the way things were in those days. There was a £10 crossing. Can you believe that? You could just get on a ship for £10 and be relocated to Australia. Admit it, if you're not in Australia now, how many of us here wish our parents had done that? But that's what she was going to go and do. She wanted to escape being seen as a single mother, and actually her plan didn't happen because he wasn't adopted. At 6 months old, he was instead placed with a foster carer, and foster carer placements didn't have to be short term. So a child could go to foster care for their entire early life, right up until adulthood back in those days. Tends now to be that you're fostered for a period of time and then adopted, but he was there for the long term. He was fostered by a couple who had the surname Tulip. You'll understand why I'm talking about his second name at this moment in time. Obviously his name's Black, but for this period of time he takes on their surname. And pretty much from day one, he shows some really disturbing tendencies. Really aggressive, has very few friends because he's considered a bully, very prone to outbursts. He was known for misbehaviour in school, for throwing things around classrooms. He would often break property around the school. And because of that, he seemed like an outlier amongst the other children. And as is the case with most children who are different in school, it can be a hard time. You know, people bully you. If you don't look, act, seem a certain way, particularly if you are from a foster or adopted home back in the day. Remember the years that we're talking about now. We're talking about a time where illegitimate children were considered shameful. If you were fostered, the school would have an idea of why you'd been fostered. And that prejudice is something that still affects kids today. So back then, okay, let's give it to him. Black would have had a challenging time. And whilst he was initially bullied by people, he kind of figured out that he wasn't going to put up with that. So he started to bully younger kids. Whilst his foster mother always wanted him to go to school clean, he didn't really care for himself at all. So he had really poor self-esteem regarding his own personal hygiene, to the point where he was bullied by his classmates. They used to call him Smelly Bobby Tulip, which again, we've got to put ourselves in that position of being a child. You already know you're different. Your mother's not around, you've been abandoned, you've been adopted or fostered by some quite old people. They were elderly people. So it's not a normal experience, is it, for a child? Then you go to school where everybody thinks that you're different. Then, for whatever reasons, your own self-esteem, your lack of care about yourself, people are telling you that you smell. It's not exactly going to put you in a good mindset, is it? You're not going to be sitting there thinking, this is a place where I fit in. And I always wonder in those early years where rage begins. Because children don't know how to handle it, do they? Kids don't really know how to manage those unmanageable feelings. As we get older, we tend to get better at masking them or managing them in more productive ways. But when you're a kid, things that frustrate you or trigger you can lead to you being pretty outrageous in your behaviour. Even wonderful children who grow up into wonderful adjusted adults can often, as kids, be found screaming their heads off in supermarket aisles because they didn't get a biscuit. You know, kids act out, right? So for somebody like Black, we could see that there's an internalised rage at this point that's getting externalised around his classmates. At 5 years old, one of the things that happens that's pivotal in Black's life is that he and a girl at school compare their genitalia. Now, this is not unusual. It really isn't. Kids play doctors and nurses. Kids ask each other what's down their pants. Yes, in the modern day, this is seen as highly inappropriate behaviour, but it is a tale as old as time. Children are not sexual beings. They are just curious and inquisitive. So the actual asking to see each other's bits is probably not the thing that we're going to say is deeply disturbing, because at the end of the day, it isn't uncommon. However, it triggered something really powerful. He believed that he should have been born female. So seeing that girl's private parts at that young age, as opposed to it just being an interesting, curious experience, it made him feel like he was in the wrong body. And that triggered a deep and lifelong obsession for him. He had this huge interest in female genitalia, and just genitalia in general, but particularly the genitals of female children and body orifices. And from the age of around 8 years of age, one of the things that he would do was he'd insert objects into his own anus. And that was something that sexually he continued throughout his adulthood. So we can see this paraphilia developing at 5 to 8 years of age. Now, instantly that draws you in, doesn't it? It draws you in to just start thinking about the psychopathology of this man. What's going on for him? This connection with wanting to be a different gender potentially. This rage at being seen by his peers as an outlier, an outcast. And also this keen interest in sexual practices so early on. We also have to note that for Black, his life with his foster parents may not have been ideal. He was often seen quite bruised. He was bruised on his face and his limbs. It did seem that there was some physical abuse at home. And even though he doesn't necessarily discuss that or suggest that there was any blame to his foster parents, one of the things that he did suggest, aside from the fact that the bruises could have been from fights, because he was always getting into fights, if he wet the bed, which was something that was considered quite chronic for him, is that he would get very badly beaten by his foster mum. Now, again, the worst way to treat a child who is bedwetting is to blame them. It's not their fault. They're not trying to do it. And usually we would expect that there was something pretty troubling in their world if they're constantly bedwetting. You know, we do see kids as old as 15 wetting the bed, very rarely, and also usually less often than you would expect a young child, but it can happen, and it doesn't have to be related to trauma. But often young children who are chronic bedwetters, we could imagine that there was maybe a reasoning behind that there was something deeper going on. So when we talk to children and we get that information from them, we're thinking a little bit outside the box, that this isn't just about some kind of medical issue. There could be something more psychological. They could be traumatized. There could be abuse. There could just be lots of dysfunction in the household so that habits don't form. And one of the big problems that we get is when a child who is acting in this way, not because they have any control over it, is then shamed for it. To shame a child for doing something they have no control over is deeply damaging. But again, we're talking about the 50s. It was not uncommon to beat children. It should have been, but it wasn't. By 1958, now both of his foster parents are dead. Again, we have to say, no matter how bad that situation was for him, imagine grieving the two adults who you'd primarily known as your parents, and you are a young person, a child still at this point. That's going to affect you. You're going to feel like you're anchorless. And of course, that leads to him moving to another family. And I think at this point, we see an escalation. We see a change from interest in the way, shall we say, our physical form is made, to his own self-interest in inserting objects into his anus for his own gratification. We see him now think about moving onto other human beings. And this is really important to note. So he actually has his first sexual offence, and it's a really terrifying one. He drags a girl, a young girl, into a public lavatory, and then he fondles her for a period of time. That is a high-level sexual offence. This is not, an inappropriate grope, which is still completely reprehensible when you're in a relationship with somebody and you don't want that to happen. That's still an offence, right? Dragging somebody into a public lavatory and sexually assaulting her, terrifying. He's reported by his own new foster mother for that, and she wants him out of the house. So when we get foster children, we know that sometimes they're going to come with a whole heap of baggage. It's difficult to be a foster child, particularly if you've been moved around, particularly if you've got abandonment issues and all the things that go in between. You know, it's hard. But this is basically from a really early age. He's kidnapping and holding a young girl and sexually molesting her. And I would completely agree that the foster mother's action to remove him from her home was the right thing to do, because she wasn't working at this point with a child who needed safety, compassion and connection. She's dealing with a sexual predator. And a sexual predator at some point can become a danger to the person who's in charge of them, particularly if that person is a female. When he goes through his adolescence, he's actually put in a children's home, and part of this is to do with the fact that he's now considered a danger. However, you do have to beg the question, is a mixed sex children's home the right place for a predator towards young girls? Apparently so. Apparently that seemed like a good idea. And unsurprisingly, what do we get? We get a huge escalation in sexually deviant behaviour. So he's constantly exposing himself. And bear in mind, when you look at rapists, often there is a trajectory. So the trajectory might be initially peeping Tom, you know, somebody who creeps around at night, tries to catch you in the state of undress. You won't know about it, but they'll be peering in through your window. And then that might not be gratifying enough. So I might look through your window and then steal some of your underwear from the washing line. And then that might not be enough. So then I'll find ways of exposing myself. I might be in a park wearing jogging bottoms, but I won't wear any underpants, and I'll kneel down and the person walking past can see the genitalia. Now that means that the person may think, oh, I shouldn't have seen that, but that person wasn't purposefully and willfully trying to get me to see it. But then that won't be enough. That won't be as provocative as is required to get the sexual kick. So then it's about exposing purposefully, willfully, masturbating in public, making sure that everybody can see. The kick is that you know that you're doing something sexual, inappropriate, and you've got as many victims as possible to engage in that activity. And ironically, you'd be amazed how many people don't report it. For some reason, boys, young men, men in general, who expose themselves in public, even masturbate in public, often are not reported to the police. And part of that will be to do with something called bystander intervention. If there is one person walking past and they meet the eyes of somebody, shall we say, masturbating in public, and there's no one else around, say it's in a park, there is a higher chance that that individual will kind of firstly be afraid and secondly think, I need to talk to the police about this. But if there are 15 walking past, the chances are everyone will imagine that somebody else will be the one to call the police. So often you are surprised to find that the more people in an environment, the less responsibility anyone takes for reporting a crime. And when you look back at Kitty Genovese, who was where we coined that whole term, bystander intervention, bystander interaction, that was because on a very, very busy street, the boyfriend who'd been spurned by Kitty stabbed her repeatedly to death with people just walking past. No one helped. And yet when we find crimes where one individual is being attacked in the street and only one other person is there, the chances are that person, knowing that there is nobody else to take responsibility, they will intervene. The human psyche is amazing, isn't it? Because you'd imagine the more numbers, the more power, the more opportunity to stop a crime. But it does not play out like that. And just a tip, if any of you ever find yourself in a situation where you find yourself under attack and there are lots of people around you, if you want to get somebody to help, look at somebody, shout them, describe them. You in the blue coat, I need help. Simple things like that. And that's a life-changing impact because the person in the blue coat suddenly realizes that they are now responsible. It's really important to recognize how sometimes the power that we have is to make sure that we identify and give responsibility to somebody so that we get the help that we need. Just a tip there. It's always interested me. In fact, in any situation, if we need any kind of help, identify the person you require help from. It's just this human instinct that if we're being asked for help, we have to attend, particularly in Western-centric culture. Because these days, if you don't do that, you'll just have loads of people videoing your death on an iPhone. Literally, it feels like people are really happy to do that, to video people whilst they're getting their head kicked in, but not to actually intervene and stop it. So it's really important to use that strategy to prevent yourself being in trouble. Much the same as the best advice if somebody is attacking you, as opposed to screaming rape, for example, screaming something like fire, for some reason seems to have more of an impact because people think that fire can affect them, as opposed to you who's dealing with the situation of sexual assault. These little things always amaze me in psychology, and I think it's good to just say it because one of you listening hopefully won't, but may find yourself in a scenario like that. Exactly the same as teaching your children from day one, and believe me, from day one, my children were taught to scream, and I mean scream, this person is not my mummy, this person is not my daddy, I do not know them, help me. Because if you don't get kids to do that and somebody's abducting them, adults are very good at saying, oh, they're just having a tantrum. Give them specific things to say. This is not my mummy, this is not my daddy, I do not know this person, help me. Believe me, if somebody walking past hears a kid saying that, they're going to intervene. Coming back to the Black case, at this point, he's exposing himself to other kids. He is found to remove forcibly the underwear of a girl, and it gets him sent to another care home, a more high discipline, high security, all male establishment. And sadly for him, and it's hard to find sympathy and empathy with a guy who at this point is a high level sexual offender. He's actually sexually abused by a male staff member for 3 years. And whilst this is just me, and obviously I don't know the ins and outs of that establishment, but if a care worker gets away with sexually abusing one of the children for 3 years, the chances are it will be endemic in the environment. It will be part of the culture. So I would imagine that he was probably abused by other people there as well. And it was really high level abuse. He was forced to do fellatio, and obviously that would have had a massive impact. Remember, this is a child who struggled to be cared for all the way along. He's gone through grief, he's gone through abandonment, but he's still at this point growing and escalating in his offending behaviour. Now, all things weren't terrible for Black. It's not like he didn't occasionally fit the normal paradigm for what we'd expect for a young person. He liked swimming, he liked football, but the truth is, the people who knew him, they felt like he didn't fit in. He really didn't have a lot of friends at all. In 1963, he leaves the Red House care home. Obviously, by this point, he's going to be traumatised. He's had horrible abuse. And as I said, we've got an add-on, an escalation to all these other horrible things that have happened to him. Bear in mind, none of this is an excuse for any of the behaviour that happens in the future. But I do think it's important that we acknowledge he didn't have a swallows and Amazons upbringing with picnics in the park and lots of friends and parties. Clearly, no one really liked him. He'd had horrible abuse and he was an oddball. Sorry, not a psychological term to use, but it's true, isn't it? Just an oddball. So he moves to another boys' home in Greenock, and at that point he gets a job as a butcher's delivery boy. It always makes me chill when I say things like that, because so many serial killers seem to find themselves in a place where they take jobs with butchers. It's not the ideal job for many, is it? Driving around dead carcasses. Is it just me? Look, I know that loads of you will eat meat. I'm not. I don't eat meat. I've not ate meat since I was a kid. In fact, I've not ate meat since my mother told me that all the lambs that I used to go and look at lovingly as I walked to school were in our freezer. That really didn't help my mindset at that point, because lambs are really cute. But even when I've gone near butchers, you know, I can smell the blood, the metallic experience of being around dead carcasses. And I can't imagine that would feel like on a daily basis, driving around dead bodies. And it does seem to be something that we can relate to lots of serial killers. Now, be prepared for this. Hashtag me too. Imagine that. Amplified beyond belief. Now, again, I'm going to be honest, the way that life was in the 50s and 60s was very different to the way it is now. These days, if you're a parent, you have to teach your boys to understand what consent is, because the law is very much weighted towards the fact that if a girl is inebriated, she can't consent to sex. If she's under 16, she can't consent to sex. If she's in any way distressed, she can't consent to sex. If she says no at any point, it is rape, and so on and so forth. These are really important things that we teach our boys. Why? Because it's a criminal offence. But in the 50s, 60s, pretty much 70s, even 80s, there did seem to be a free-for-all around how women were allowed to be treated. And remember, this is a young guy. He's a delivery driver. He's going to homes of people to take in the carcasses. He was said during that period to have fondled 30 to 40 young girls. 30 to 40. So if he arrives at a house and he sees that a young girl's alone, he just lets himself in, sexually assaults them, gets back in his van. Now, none of these incidents were reported, but obviously when Black was tried, people came forward to talk about it. And again, this is because sexual abuse and molestation just wasn't taken seriously in these eras. They just weren't. It was one of those things that was kind of brushed under the carpet. Let's just get on with it. It's terrifying to me that this happened. But I can still recall people in popular culture, Paula Yates, who's no longer with us, Tracy Emin, an amazing, amazing artist. These both writing books and talking about the fact that when they were young, you know, they get paid 50p to lift up their skirts and show their knickers to the gardeners, or the kind of weird guy who is the adult who just have sex with them. These are all documented cases, but they didn't complain because it was just part and parcel of growing up. That's literally how people used to treat sexual abuse, and we wonder why we have so many traumatized adults in our world. So him getting away with those 30 to 40 cases, unsurprising. And you know what? If 30 to 40 people came forward to admit it, there would have been hundreds. And there would have been repeated offences. Because you can bet your bottom dollar, if he went round to somebody's house and he sexually assaulted somebody, gets away with it, then he's going to be delivering that bacon again, and he's going to be doing the same behaviour. That's what violent perpetrators do. And it also shows the gravitas of his crime. This guy really isn't thinking about consequences. He's very, very poor in his impulse control. Because remember, he's driving around in a van delivering meat. It's not like he's creeping in through the back door, assaulting somebody and escaping without them being able to identify them. They'd just be like, yeah, it was the butcher guy who comes around and delivers our food. So you know he's not thinking about consequences. Maybe part of that is because he's been sexually abused himself and there's been no consequences there. So he sees this as something that is more normalised. And again, let's just put this into context. 99.9999999% of people who are sexually molested will not go on to molest. And the same statistic of people who are molested will find being molested absolutely hideous, horrific, terrifying, dehumanizing, shameful. It will lead to so many horrible consequences for those individuals who don't deserve any of it. And then there's this tiny, tiny minority who buy in the end to that abuse. So as opposed to repulsing them, it starts to attract them. And I guess if you think statistically, that makes sense. Because if we think about what I said earlier on about the wiring of the brain, a paedophile at some point who's a child molester will come across a child who has the same wiring. So to some degree, the activation of that may be less problematic for that child than it would be for the typical child. This is, again, me making assumptions. I have no evidence that that's the case in this case, but I think it's really important to say. And as always, let me reiterate, it drives me mad when I hear people say, most people who abuse were abused. What we should say is a tiny, tiny percentage of people who are sexually molested will go on to sexually molest others. Tiny percentage. That's the way it works. The majority, vast majority of people who are sexually molested would do anything to stop anybody else ever going through the hell that they went through. And I think that's really important because often people who have been sexually molested worry that they may be considered somebody who would go on to abuse others themselves. And it doesn't play out in truth. The first conviction that Black receives, he basically meets a 7-year-old girl. She's playing alone in a park. That was not unusual. It still shouldn't be unusual. 7-year-old children should be allowed to play alone in a park. My own children did. It does not make you a bad parent. It makes you a parent trying to forge resilience in your children and make them enjoy a world that should be safe. However, it wasn't in this moment. So Black gets her to go with him to a deserted air raid shelter and uses the classic ruse, do you want to come and see my kittens? And for people who think that children are not the kind of children that would go ahead and do this, you might think your child would never go ahead and do it. We have tested this out hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times psychologically, and the results are terrifying. Because pretty much most kids, they just trust the adult. If you go up to a child in a park and they're on their own and you start chatting to them, they give you trust straight away. If you then say, I've got these kittens, do you fancy coming and looking at them? Most kids, they'll just take that person's hand and off they go. Because fortunately for most children, adults are kind. So they're not thinking, this person's about to do something horrible to me. They're like, yeah, I'll go and see the kittens. He then actually takes this girl and he strangles her to a point of unconsciousness. This wouldn't have been difficult for him. He's a young adult. She loses consciousness and he enjoys it. And he actually masturbates all over her body. So at this point, we are now becoming seriously concerned about this guy's capacity for harm. I mean, a 7-year-old child. Imagine the impact, the damage on that little girl. Now, he is arrested the next day. He's charged with lewd and libidinous behaviour. And they actually do a psychiatric evaluation on him. But as ever, it went really well. And he was completely seen to be a huge threat. I'm being sarcastic, that didn't happen. In fact, the psychiatrist was like, yeah, it's a one-off. Don't need to worry about it. Doesn't need any treatment. Now, he did get into trouble. He was given a serious sentence for that offence. But the point was, how missed was that opportunity? How could you imagine that he was in a situation where he'd carried out something so diabolical and the psychiatrist just said it was a one-off? Like, who just on a one-off takes a 7-year-old child, almost kills her, sexually violates her, and then is just expected to carry on with their life happily, like a really well-adjusted person. That was such a grave error, in my opinion. And it was a different time, but it's either he was incredibly manipulative and managed to convince the person who was doing the evaluation that he was sane, or it was just really shoddy workmanship, as far as I'm concerned, on the psychiatrist's part. So after this offence, he does move back to Grangemouth, and he ends up lodging with an elderly couple, works for a builder's supply company, and he does manage to start quite successfully dating a girl that he meets at a local youth club. At this point, he's 16, and they're dating for several months, and they're very happy. He wanted her to marry him. So we know that there is obviously something that's changed in his manner. He's able to keep this relationship going to some degree, and he's thinking about a future with her. But she actually turns him down when he proposes. And one of the main reasons that she does this is she thinks his sexual demands are really unreasonable. And if you think about what he's done in the past, and then you think about what he's doing to young children, and you also consider the obsession that he had with female genitalia, I would imagine that some of the requests that he was asking her to fulfill were probably not ones that she would feel comfortable doing. Again, in modern Western life, we have lots and lots of different predilections sexually that are considered completely normal. BDSM might be on a spectrum, for example, but lots of people enjoy it. It's very openly talked about. We have people who do puppy play and dress up as dogs. We have people who dress up as big babies. You know, there is this massive spectrum, and whatever your opinion of that, it's now in mainstream. But when he was growing up, actually being really overt in your sexual desires, being unusual in your sexual practices, that would potentially, in quite a conservative population, have caused concerns for the person that he was with, and she breaks off that relationship. Does this then trigger that rage further? The fact that he's been rejected and abandoned by another girl? Who knows? But certainly it would suggest that it causes him some kind of friction and dysfunction in his sexual connection, because what happens next is he starts to molest young children further. 1966, the landlords that he is living with realise he's actually been molesting their granddaughter. She was 9. And it wasn't one-off occasion, it was every single time that that child visited the household, he was sexually molesting her. Now, this will blow your mind. They didn't tell the police. Isn't it incredible? They said they didn't tell the police because they felt it would be too traumatic for their granddaughter. Missed opportunity. I understand that there was a great amount of shame associated with sexual abuse. Listen, the amount of victim blaming that went on then and even now is something that caused people not to react. But in modern day, we understand that if you don't act on that kind of situation, the child is the one that feels responsible. Because if no one gets in trouble for basically raping and molesting them, then that must mean they deserved it. You know, that's how children interpret the world. Or they must have done something wrong. They should feel guilty for it. This is not the way we deal with children now. And even in today's day and age, believe me, a lot of abuse gets swept under the carpet because a child will confess that this has happened to them, but the consequences, the fallout, family-wise, even where they live, is so catastrophic that they end up withdrawing the allegation. So even in modern day, when we're meant to be so much better at this, often children carry the burden of guilt and shame for somebody else's crime. So they don't actually speak to the police. They don't want her to have that trauma. It means that he's getting away with it even further. Soon after, he does lose his job, and I wonder whether a quiet word was had. But that then means he returns to Kinlochleven, which is where he then lodges with a married couple who have a 6-year-old daughter. Note this theme. He takes lodgings where he has access to children. That's what child molesters do. They spend their time finding different avenues into their desired victim's life. And if there's a 6-year-old daughter and a married couple, chances are that married couple will at times be like, hey, Black, can you look after my daughter for a few hours? It's just the way things work. So he knows that if there is a young child and he is predisposed to be attracted to 5 to 11-year-old girls, that poor child was put in ultimate danger and would undoubtedly have found themselves molested. As I've just said, unsurprisingly, within a year, that family accused Black of repeatedly molesting their daughter. And he actually pleads guilty to it, at least to 3 counts of indecent assault against a child. And he gets a year at Polmont Borstal in Brighton's, which basically is there to rehabilitate really serious serial youth offenders. But isn't it shocking? He's still this really young man. Most of us are thinking about what we're going to do on our summer holidays and who we fancy, but this guy is orchestrating and manipulating and finding ways to have access to children on every level. And that child will have been abused from day one all the way through for a year. Polmont Borstal is a place that he said taught him that he never wanted to be imprisoned again. Now remember, we know that he's talked about his previous experiences at Red House Care Home, but there was something beyond that experience that happened at Polmont Borstal, because he said that was it. He didn't want to ever go back to prison. I would hazard a guess that he was probably very badly bullied there, but I would imagine he was probably also brutalised there. I think he was probably an individual, because he was quite difficult to fit in, also because his crimes were so heinous, and because on top of that, his victims tend to be very vulnerable. That means most likely he didn't have the physical prowess to meet other people who are his age and older on the same territory. Chances are that he would have been brutalised really badly there. So in 1968, 6 months after he gets let out of Polmont, he moves back to London. He finds lodging in a bedsit. It's pretty close to King's Cross Station. And then he just does lots of casual jobs. One of them's, bizarrely, a lifeguard at a Hornsey swimming pool, which, with respect, what does that give you access to? Who goes to lots of swimming pools? Yeah, young kids, young girls. And unsurprisingly, he gets fired because he's fondling young girls there. Again, what's mind-blowing is that no charges are actually brought. This is already somebody who's sustained offending behaviour, has been accepted and noted and tried and imprisoned for, but no charges are met. We also know around this time he starts collecting child pornography. And to put this into context as well, if you use child pornography, you are a child molester. You do not have to come into contact with any child to be a child molester. If you ingest and view or make child pornography, you are a child molester, even if your hands never physically touch, because you are violating children and you are also encouraging other people to violate them vicariously. He really liked magazine and photograph pornography, but then he did move on to watching videos, and the videos that he watched were graphic sexual abuse. Graphic. He was also known to actually go out and take pictures of children. So he wouldn't do this in a sexual way. He would just go out and take pictures of kids between the ages of about 8 and 12 years of age in parks and playgrounds. This is one of the reasons why some parks and playgrounds actually have a no photography policy, because whilst you're enjoying taking that cute pic of your kid on swing, the guy behind the bushes is doing it for a whole different reason. I always find it ironic when I think about what these kind of bizarre, dangerous molesters do in their spare time. And one of the things that he would do, he used to go to the pub called the Three Crowns. It was in Stamford Hill. And what the locals knew about him was that he was a really proficient darts player. Yep, even grotesque humans like this can find a skill base somewhere. But there he also met Edward and Kathy Rayson, and he moved into their attic. Now, the Raysons considered Black responsible, if somewhat reclusive, tenant. You know, they didn't have any concerns about him beyond the fact that he smelt. Again, it seems like early on in his life, when he was taught to be hygienic and failed as a child, he never really carried that through into adulthood. He remained really unhygienic. He smelt a lot. They did think that he was watching pornography, but they didn't know it was child pornography. And he actually managed to remain their lodger until he was arrested. And that was in July 1990. So that was a long period of time. Now, we know that he's got lots of odd jobs, but he's not really finding any employment that sticks, which is when long distance driving employment begins. So in the mid-1970s, he goes ahead and he buys a white Fiat van. So he gets a permanent job as a van driver for a company called Poster Dispatch and Storage. And that's a Hoxton-based firm who basically deliver posters everywhere. You know, pictures of pop stars, billboard advertisements, and basically went all across the UK, Ireland, and also all across Europe. Now, to his employers, Black's considered a really good worker. He undertakes long distance driving. He is really happy to do the jobs that some of the people who were in employment and were married didn't want to do. You know, not everybody wants to be away from their families for long periods of time, but he was like absolutely fine with it. Now, one of the things that we know that Black managed to acquire was an excellent knowledge of much of the UK road network. This is really important because if you want to abduct children, you're going to need to know, firstly, the easiest place to do that, and secondly, where you can get rid of the bodies, right? Because you don't want to abduct a child, murder them, and then drop off the body in the same area. And that's very simply because of this. When a child goes missing, they execute a micromillimeter search in their home area. If you're dumping a body 200 miles away, you can bet that it's going to take time to find that body, and then they're going to have to go through linking that body to the missing children. And remember, you would be quite surprised to know how many children do go missing. Most turn up, but children do go missing on a daily basis. So it can be a really difficult job to piece together who that child's body belongs to. The other reason, of course, is the fact that if you're hundreds of miles away, eyewitness reports are going to be more problematic, aren't they? Because somebody picking up a child in a white van in one place, but another person not seeing anything of that van for hundreds of miles, takes you outside of the area. And are you really going to notice somebody taking something from a white van? We see it all the time. Delivery drivers are always taking things. Fly tippers are always using white vans to go and fly tip. So like I said, there are reasons why he was quite clever in using the type of abduction and murder that he used. Another thing that Black was very manipulative over was his appearance. So he would make sure that at certain points when he abducted a child, he would be clean shaven, or he'd shave his head, or he'd grow a beard. That's important. He also had lots of pairs of spectacles. So we know that every single time he's trying to abduct a child, he's also aware that he has to make himself look a certain way so that if somebody does happen to be an eyewitness, it's going to be hard to identify him. Another thing that he did with his van was he put opaque black curtains at the back windows. You're going to do that, aren't you? You don't want anybody seeing into your van, because if you've subdued a child and that child is obviously going to be seen by people driving past, particularly HGV drivers who can look down and in, that is going to cause concern, and the likelihood would have been he'd be apprehended by the police. Now, as ever, I'm going to say that the murders were brutal. I'm going to take you through them. If this isn't for you, please fast forward to the end, which is where we'll talk about his sentencing. But these are brutal and they are child-based. The first victim, as far as we know where murder is concerned, because like I said, I think he probably murdered many more children. He killed a young child called Jennifer Cardy. She was abducted, she was sexually assaulted, and she was murdered on the 12th of August 1981. She was basically last seen by her mum at 1:40 p.m. in the afternoon. She was just cycling to a friend's house. And hours later, her bike was discovered, and that was discovered just less than a mile from her home. It was covered with branches and leaves. Now, instantly, just as a mother, if you see that your child's bike's been covered with branches and leaves, you know that that's not your child who's done it. The stand by the bicycle was actually down, so it means it should probably been stopped because she put that stand down so that she could have that conversation. And the likelihood was that she had been having a conversation with her abductor. 200 volunteers took part in the search and they found absolutely nothing. Jennifer's body was found 6 days later by men who were fishing. She was in a reservoir, her head was in it, she'd been drowned, but they also found that she'd got ligature marks, so she'd been strangled and she'd been sexually abused. And it is horrific to imagine that 16 miles away from her home, this is how she met her doom. You know, this is a horrific death. One of the things that the coroner concluded was that the likelihood is, even though she was horribly sexually assaulted and strangled, it was actually the drowning that killed her. Can't cope knowing that whenever I think about a child's last moments, you know, they're going to be wanting their mum, wanting their dad, just wanting somebody to come and save her. Really terrifying. One of the things that the police in the local area felt, just because of where the girl had been taken and where her body had been left, is that whoever had done it must have known the area. But even though that to some degree puts black in the frame, if you think about it on a policing level, they're going to be thinking it's somebody maybe who knew her, it's somebody local to the area, it's somebody who knows the area well. Remember, this is a guy who's a white van driver. He's going all over the country, all over the UK and everywhere else. So he wouldn't be the most obvious suspect. They're looking probably at neighbours, maybe even people who knew her as a friend of the family. The next killing that we hear about is of Susan Maxwell. She's 11 years old. 11 years old. She lived in Cornhill-on-Tweed, which is pretty much the English side of the Anglo-Scottish border. She's abducted on the 30th of July 1982. Basically, she's walking home, she's been playing tennis. She's last seen by a witness at 4:30 p.m. and she was crossing a bridge over the River Tweed. They believe that it was around that time that Black abducted her. And of course, the next day, a search is mounted. I know that a day seems like a long time, but there often used to be a scenario where even with a child, there would have to be 24 hours before that person would be considered missing. Now we have completely different alert systems, and rightfully so, because if a child goes missing and they are abducted by somebody who's intending to do them harm, they're often dead within an hour. So we need to find those children as fast as possible. But this took till the following day. They get search dogs, 300 officers are basically assigned full time to this. Every single property is searched because this shows you how dedicated that these officers were to find this little girl. And they actually did this over 80 square miles. That is a lot of miles to cover. Now, we do now get eyewitnesses saying that a white van has been seen, and that one of these white vans that were seen were in the field of a gateway off the A697. So again, we're starting to get just these anecdotal ideas that a white van may be involved in a crime. But again, to the police, there must be hundreds of white vans for good legitimate reasons. So it wouldn't necessarily have been the thing to trigger in any police officer's mind that this is somebody who's a long distance lorry driver. Now, on August the 12th, that little girl's body is found by a lorry driver. And again, she's been covered with undergrowth. While she was still clothed, she had been gagged and she had been bound. And even though she was still dressed, her underwear had been removed. And that, without doubt, suggests that she'd been sexually assaulted. It does seem, as I suggested earlier, that as most cases go, when a child is abducted and murdered, it tends to happen very quickly. In fact, they believe that she was murdered pretty much as soon as she had been abducted, but that he had kept her dead body in the van for around 24 hours. Although arguably what they do say is she could have been alive for those 24 hours, but nonetheless, she would have been in that van for 24 hours. And the reason they think that is because his route went from Edinburgh to Dundee and Glasgow, which is where he basically made his final deliveries. Because the following day, he actually dumped her body when he was taking the route from Glasgow back to London. He actually got rid of the body around Uttoxeter, which is about 425 miles from where she'd been initially abducted. So again, it's throwing people off the scent, isn't it? How long will it take for that body to be found? What level of decomposition will it be in? How difficult is it then for the coroner to confirm how that child has died? But, imagine being the parents. Imagine knowing. Because you would, wouldn't you? You would know that something terrible had befallen your child. And like I said, every murder is terrible. Every single murder is a life that has been tragically cut short. But the feelings it evokes and provokes in me when I think about somebody murdering a child, I'm always one of those people who believes that every human being has the capacity to kill. I genuinely think that, because I think that you can have righteous rage. And I never want to do anybody harm. I really don't. But when I think about child killers, I want to kill them. That's what I'm saying about that spectrum of behaviour. That no matter how peaceable you are, no matter how loving and compassionate you are, if somebody is going to murder and rape kids, there's a part of me that just wants to kill them instantly. So to be a parent of a child like that, I cannot imagine feeling anything but a rage of wanting to rip them limb from limb slowly. The next victim is Caroline Hogg. Caroline's 5. Caroline is 5 years old. She's just playing outside. Just playing outside her home in Edinburgh, something she'll have done every single day of the week. It's July 83 when she doesn't come home at the time that she's meant to be home. Some of you might think, what was a 5-year-old doing playing out? But this was just common practice. In fact, this still is common practice in so many places, because children are surrounded by other children. They have siblings, they have peers. And actually, we can't victim blame. Why should a 5-year-old not be able to play out? You know, that's what kids are meant to be doing. The last 12 months, you wouldn't think that was what kids were meant to be doing, but that's why we know there's going to be untold damage on our children, because that's what kids should be doing, playing out. But nonetheless, this little 5-year-old girl doesn't come home, and the whole area starts searching. And it's at this point where a little boy comes forward and says he saw Caroline with a man on the nearby promenade. And that was obviously where they were searching. You know, this is a really local area. So now we see that the police recognise that something very serious is happening to children. The search that happened was the largest in Scottish history. They had thousands of volunteers, thousands. They had members of the Royal Scots Fusiliers. They had police searching literally all over that area, all over Edinburgh, and it basically made headline news. This is a 5-year-old child, a 5-year-old child just playing outside her home who's gone missing. 9 known paedophiles were identified as being in that area on that day, but every single one of them were eliminated from the inquiry. And this is at the point where we start getting eyewitnesses noticing that there was somebody in the area that just caused them an instinctual concern. There was something about him that brought him to their attention. They said that he was a guy who was balding, he looked unclean, he looked like he was suspicious. He was wearing horn-rimmed glasses, remember, he's always changing glasses. And they noticed that he was watching that little girl as she was playing. And they also noticed that he seemed to follow her to a nearby fairground. Now, adding another witness in here, again, this is so important. We've got a 14-year-old girl called Jennifer Booth, And she actually sees Caroline sat with this weird looking guy. And what she hears, she doesn't hear the conversation that's going on, but she hears Caroline say, "Yes, please," to some of the questions that this weirdo is asking her. And this is what I'm telling you earlier. This is why every parent needs to tell their child how to deal with strangers. We need to educate our children from day one. We need to make them aware of their boundaries, because as I've said, we can repeat this exercise constantly. You would be amazed how quickly children will walk off with a stranger. But this witness sees Caroline taking his hand and walking away. And he actually pays for Caroline to ride a carousel as he's watching her, building trust, letting this little girl think that he's a good man. But one of the things that the witness also noted was that Caroline seemed frightened. We know that Caroline remained in that van for at least 24 hours. And it just breaks my heart. It breaks my heart to imagine that little girl on that fairground. Even though she was being paid for, there was something about this guy that witness who gave testimony said that she thought that little girl was afraid. And yet, in spite of that, he managed to get her in that van. On July the 18th, Caroline's body is found. It was naked. A 5-year-old's body, naked in a ditch close to the M1. That's nearly 500 kilometres from where she'd been abducted. And it's actually only around 39 kilometres from where Maxwell's body had been found the previous year. Again, the problem with the fact that there'd been this time lapse meant that it was really hard for the coroner to understand what had actually killed her. But what we do know is that we can look at his MO and without a doubt, there would be a sexual motive. The fact that she was naked would have suggested that anyway. It's terrifying now to imagine that we have this child serial killer on the loose, and it seems like he's pretty indiscriminate. You know, he just goes for whoever he can get, and he's clever around the way that he manages the abducting and the removing of the bodies. This is something that's making him hard to track. Now, these cases are gathering momentum. So the following March, there's actually a television reconstruction of the abduction, and it's broadcast nationally. This is a big deal. And Caroline's father's actually involved in it. He says, you know, you never think it will happen to you, but it can. And it could again if this person isn't caught. It's just horrific to imagine that any parent would go through this. Police at this point realise that Susan and Caroline's murders have to be linked. They just think that the MO is very similar, and they also feel that they're looking for one individual who has carried out these murders. Mostly, they do that because there's such a distance between when the body is found and where the body was abducted that essentially it feels too similar. So they've imagined that this could be, you know, a lorry driver, a van driver, or even a sales representative. And I will tell you a personal story. When I was 20, I was working part-time in service stations trying to sign people up for credit cards, you know, trying to make money to go traveling, things like that. And a guy came in and I signed him up for this credit card. Now, I don't know whether he gave me his real details, but about 15 minutes later, he came back into the service station and he said to me, could I help him? Because he had a problem. He had locked himself out of his car, and could I reach down because the window was open a little bit so I could put my arm through to try to reach the knob that would lift up. Because would you believe it, when I was a kid, you didn't have automatic locks, you just had these little kind of buttons that pulled up and they were either up or down, and he wanted me to reach in and to pull that up. I was a young kid. I was pretty bright, but he'd signed up, you know, I'd made some money. So I thought to myself, okay. And he'd parked right at the end Bear in mind, there are lots of spaces local to this service station. He'd parked right at the end and also right near an exit where you could be taken back onto the motorway. And yet I still walked there. And I've always been quite savvy, but I still walked there. And he was right, the window was kind of a little bit down. And I remember thinking, why would you leave your window down a bit if you're going all the way to a service station to get some food when anybody could, if I can get in, potentially get into your car? This is all going through my head, but I still went to do that. And I can remember starting to put my hand down to open it and feeling him getting closer to me. And just something in my intuition made me pull back, and I just said, I'm really sorry, I can't. And I just started to run back. And I cannot tell you that that was definitely something that would have ended in a bad situation for me, but it stayed with me my whole life. Because not long after, a sales representative, which is definitely what he was found guilty of a series of rapes. And the way that he got people to get into cars was to essentially get their arms stuck, put something over their mouth that basically made them unconscious, and bundle them into the back of the car. Now, I'm not saying that was definitely what happened to me in that situation. I'm saying that you would be amazed how confident human beings can act in ways that cause themselves great harm. And certainly I look back and it makes me shudder. The police are now looking for an individual who, as far as they're concerned, have murdered and sexually assaulted at least 2 children. One of the things that we know is that both the girls were wearing white socks when they were abducted, and one of the assumptions there is that there might have been a fetish. He may have had a particular predilection for young girls in white socks. Again, that's not necessarily something that's proven, but it definitely seems like he went for particular types of girl. Also, he's definitely an opportunist, isn't he? You know, if he sees a child, he gets access to a child, he goes ahead and takes that child. And also, we're introduced back to that behaviour, aren't we? That he's not really bothered if people see him. I mean, he takes Caroline to a fairground. So witnesses are not his concern. He's either massively arrogant and really doesn't believe that anybody's going to catch him, or the fantasy is so important to him that it's worth the risk. And one of the things that we find out about serial killers is that idea of what the killing will be like, the idea of the gratification of what they'll feel, is never as good as the fantasy that they have in their head, which is why we see this repetition, because they're always trying to get to that level that they think that they can achieve. But as I've said before in my videos, people, children, all of us, we're unpredictable in nature. So a fantasy that you have in your head is rarely played out in reality. Now, the police understandably and sensibly start contacting so many of the travel companies, the trade companies, the transport companies, you know, anybody who could be regularly going through certain routes, they are questioning. They want to know who was where on what date. And that is a really important thing to note, because this is when policing is becoming more and more cohesive. It's where we are starting to talk to each other as agencies. And that is really how we've arrived where we are now today. And certainly in cases I've covered before, we're seeing, certainly in this era, this recognition that we have to work together as services. Unfortunately, there aren't any particular breakthroughs at this moment in time, but the cooperation between the 4 police forces that are working in this show a real desire to find this killer. Now, these murders were really playing on the minds of the constabularies who were working together. There were 500,000 index cards relating to the Caroline's case alone. And one of the reasons for that was because of some of the problems that they'd had with the Yorkshire Ripper case, because the information that had come in was so huge, it had actually collapsed a ceiling, and that was how much information. So they really needed to have synergy and synchronicity in this particular case to make sure that the investigation was carried out effectively. We also see computers now being used, and that meant that they were able to collate information on databases. Again, it's not like it was today, but it did mean that other forces could actually look at the information. And for us, that's just so normal. We can Google pretty much anything. And task forces tend to work together really efficiently because they have access to the same systems, but it means that we've got all this information being linked, and that's how things are linked back to Black. Sadly, Black isn't apprehended at this point, and around 7 p.m. on March the 26th, 1986, 10-year-old Sarah Jane Harper disappears from Leeds. At 7:50 p.m. on 26th of March 1986, this little 10-year-old girl, Sarah Jane Harper, just disappears. She disappears from Leeds. She's left her home to go and buy a loaf of bread from a corner shop, literally 100 metres from her home. 100 metres from her home. And she did actually buy the loaf of bread. She buys 2 packs of crisps. And at around 7:55 p.m, this balding guy briefly enters the shop, and then he leaves after the little girl has made her purchases. That's the last time she's seen alive. She's walking into an alley leading towards her home. When an hour later she doesn't get home, her mother and obviously her sisters are really scared. They go looking in the streets. Pretty quickly they realise that she's nowhere to be found, and they report her missing to the police. Massive search is taken out straight away. They're all desperate to find this little girl. They go house to house, they inquire all over the local area, they distribute leaflets, everything that they can do to find this girl is done. 200 volunteers are there, they look at a reservoir, they have underwater units out there, and the one thing that they really come up with is that there has been a white Ford Transit van in that area where Harper had been abducted. Now, at this point, there were 2 men who were described who'd been around that particular area where Sarah had disappeared, but one of them matched a stocky and balding description. So through identifying that there's been this kind of stocky, balding guy, they then asked to search all the locations where previous bodies of children have been found. There is a really sad press conference where Sarah's mum, Jackie, tells journalists that she thinks her daughter is dead. She feels like the uncertainty is horrific, but she just wants to know where her daughter's body is. She even says, I just want to bring her back even if she's dead. I mean, one of the things that blows my mind about murderers, and particularly child murderers, are the callous disregard of the impact that they have on all the families who just lives are blown to smithereens because of this. How can anyone feel that they have the right or the justification not only to carry out heinous crimes towards innocent children, but then to disregard not only their bodies, but the impact that that death has on that whole family? I mean, it destroys families. Imagine being that mother and actually having to do a press conference where you acknowledge that you think your child is dead, but you just want to be able to hold her body one more time or lay her to rest. It just always stays with me, knowing that these kind of things happen, that these kind of lives are lost. On the 19th of April, a man does really sadly discover Sarah's partially dressed body. She's gagged again, she's bound, and she's floating in the River Trent near Nottingham. That's 71 miles away from where she has been abducted. And she died about 5 to 8 hours after she was last seen. Her death was caused by drowning, but she'd also received quite severe head injuries. They think that there was a chance that she was unconscious when she was thrown into the water, but she'd also been horrifically and violently sexually assaulted before being thrown into the river. In fact, the pathologist said that they were some of the worst injuries that he had ever seen. Unbelievably, however, a witness contacts West Yorkshire Police to say that around 9:15 p.m. on the 26th of March, he had seen a white van with a stocky balding man standing by a passenger door, parked close to the River Soar. that description and that driver description matched those which were also given by the residents of Morley near Leeds, where the little girl was abducted. Now, at this point, they take those eyewitness accounts very, very seriously. It turns out that Black refueled his van in Newport the following afternoon, and it seems like it was likely that he'd driven Sarah to Ratcliffe on Soar and then discarded her body. Now, the police are really clever at this point because they realise that if he's doing these journeys, he's also going to have to go to different petrol stations to refuel. So they go and question all the service stations on the M1 motorway between the areas they expected him to be. And they ask about whether they've seen anybody who's acting unusually or whether there's a transit van that seemed a little bit out of place. But even though somebody comes forward and says, yeah, actually I did, they couldn't give the description of the driver, but they did know that there was a transit van that was acting and seeming out of place on that evening. Initially, and unbelievably to me, the police didn't think that at this point the same murderer had killed Sarah as had killed the other girls. I mean, I don't know why. I mean, there's a white transit van, there's a balding, stocky guy, there's odd behaviour, there's a child that gets abducted, a body that turns up miles and miles away. But okay, there wasn't in the first instinct to believe that that was the same pattern. When the body is found, however, that's when he revises his opinion and recognises that there's also loads of similarities. She'd been prepubescent, she'd been very young, she was white, she'd been abducted from northern England, she was found dead in the Midlands, and all three victims had actually been discovered within a 26-mile radius of Ashby-de-la-Zouch, with little effort really being made to cover their bodies. You know, they used to be found covered in a bit of bracken and leaves, but there was no attempt to bury them. Again, what does that say about this guy? What does it say about Black? That he just had no intention of covering up the bodies. He either felt that nobody could connect him, or he was just arrogant to believe that nobody was that clever to actually be able to pin cases on him. Or who knows, maybe a part of him wanted to be found. I don't know. Only he knows that. One of the reasons that the police didn't initially link Sarah's murder to the other murders is because of the level of decomposition that happened with the body. So with Sarah, they could clearly see that she had been horrifically violated sexually, whereas the others couldn't be proven in that respect. So they were looking differently at this case. Now, that blows my mind, because why would somebody just murder kids? There's always a reasoning behind it, and pretty much 99.9% of the time it's sexually motivated. The fact that they weren't wearing underwear would be all I'd need to know, or that a body was found naked, all you'd need to know. That's a sexual attack. Sarah's murder prompted even more police working together. 6 police forces were involved, and they are really, really committed to their investigation. They genuinely know that they have a serial killer at hand. And that's very challenging for the police, because we have this large area which has parents completely terrified because it could be their child next. We have a perpetrator who, in spite of lots of eyewitness reports, still has gone undetected. And the actual cost so far is nearly £1 million. Now, that is a huge amount of money at this point in time. It just shows you how terrified the police are that this individual is on the loose and is likely to strike again. And they actually speak to the FBI, because the FBI at this point have really pioneered psychological profiling of murderers. And they did a profile on this particular killer. Another thing that the police start to do is they look at cases of people who have been tried and found guilty of serious sexual offences against children. They want to look at those individuals, you know, people who had been convicted of child murder, abduction, rape, and so on and so forth. Every single police force in the UK had to check their databases for people who'd received convictions for any of those offences, and they wanted them to be looked at within a 10-year space. So they were really looking for this person now. Now, it actually did manage to narrow the cases down to 40,000 men, but come on, 40,000 men is a lot of people. But you know what's ironic? Black's name didn't even meet the list. The only conviction he'd ever received was in 1967. So they're not even looking for him. The profile that was given by the FBI to the UK was pretty accurate. It described the killer as a white male between 30 and 40 years of age, more likely towards the age of 40, who is a classic loner. He'd be unkempt in appearance. He would have received less than 12 years of formal education. The likelihood was that he would live alone in rented accommodation in a lower middle class neighbourhood. And the main reasoning that the profile gave for offending was that he had a sexual fixation with children. He was a child sex offender. He liked lots of pornography. He liked keeping souvenirs from his victims. And there was also a strong possibility that he engaged in necrophilia with his victims' bodies before their death and after their death. So it seems like their FBI profile was pretty much bang on. Remember, at this point, in spite of all this money, in spite of all these searches, in spite of all these key eyewitnesses, he's still on the run. Still out there. Still killing, potentially. And on the 23rd of April 1988, there is an attempted abduction of a teenage girl. It's in Nottingham, and initially the police see that as separate to the 3 child killings that they're aware of. So it's actually unreported to the senior investigators in the National Manhunt. Don't ask me why. I mean, I'm always one of those people who thinks, well, may as well just have a conversation with them, but no, for whatever reason, the person was like, nah, this is completely unrelated. This guy in a white van trying to abduct a young girl, that can't possibly be linked to any of the other killings that have occurred, but that happened. Even though, with respect to the police, every single chief constable across the whole of the UK had said, if anything like this happens, anything that comes close to this happens, you have to get in touch with us. Now, Teresa Thornhill was 15 years old, but she was 4'11". That's why he went for her. He thought she was younger. She'd been at a social gathering, loads of friends in a park. She was with a boyfriend and a group of teenagers, and she ended up walking home with her boyfriend. They'd said goodbye to each other, and at that point, a blue transit van stopped ahead of her. He got out. He raised the bonnet and he said to her, "Can you fix engines?" Now, of course, instantly, as a child, no matter how old you are, you're going to think, mate, I'm going to politely suggest that, looking at me, I'm not a qualified mechanic. But it kind of shows you, doesn't it, that kind of manipulative way that he's trying to engage her. And she obviously says, no, and carries on walking, but she starts walking faster. This is a 15-year-old. She's been around. She's heard about stranger danger. She knows that bad things happen. And at this point, Black grabs her, puts his arms around her mouth and navel, and attempts to drag her into his vehicle. But she isn't going. She's kicking, she's screaming, she's literally doing everything that she can. And even though he wrestles her to his van, the one thing that she does, which is so utterly brilliant of her, is she grabs his balls. She squeezes them tight, and that gives him enough pain that he lets go of her, and she bites him. He actually calls her a bitch at this point. Imagine that. He's about to remove her by force, no doubt rape her and murder her, but because she bites him, she gets called a bitch. But she screams. She screams. She gets her feet wedged on each side of the door frame. She resists and resists and resists. And at that point, her boyfriend who'd been walking her home has heard her. And he runs towards the van and he starts shouting. And he actually says, and even though this is a terrible story and there is no humour about this, I love the fact that he said, "Let go of her, you fat bastard." Because it's just powerful, isn't it? It shows no fear. This isn't a young man running towards, worried about anything for himself. He's like, get off of you bastard. And at that point, he lets go of her and she runs to her boyfriend and he gets back in, drives away. Thank God for that girl and her boyfriend. She runs home, tells her parents what's happened. They call the police straight away. Both of the youngsters are questioned and they describe him perfectly. Unkempt, overweight, balding, heavily built, between 40 and 50 and about 5'7". Exactly what the FBI profiler had stated. This is the moment where everything changes. Black was arrested in Stowe on the 14th of July 1990. David Herx, a 53-year-old retired postmaster, was mowing his front garden when he saw a blue transit van slow to a standstill across the road. The driver exited the van, apparently to clean his windscreen, as the 6-year-old daughter of a neighbour of his passed his field on view. So Herx starts to clear grass cuttings from his lawnmower, and all of a sudden he sees that little girl getting lifted from the pavement. And then he watches as the driver of the vehicle pushes something, in this case that little girl in fact, through the passenger door before getting in and starting the engine, and he just realises he's seen an abduction. He gets the number plate, and as it speeds away, the first thing he does, he runs to the girl's home, he tells the girl's mother, and she calls the police. Within minutes, literally minutes, 6 police vehicles arrive. And as Herx is describing this van, and this is when I just think divine intervention occurs, he watches it driving in their direction. And he actually is able to say, that's him, that's the same van. Officer gets in the van's path, forces it to halt. The police remove the driver from his seat, handcuff him, and this just sends chills down my spine because one of the officers was the father of the abducted girl, and he opens the rear of the van and he's just calling his daughter's name, and she's in a sleeping bag. He's tied her up in a sleeping bag, and there's his daughter, her wrists bound behind her back, her legs tied together. She's bound and gagged with plaster, and she has this hood tie over her head. Can you believe that? Can you believe? Not only does that neighbour see this little girl get abducted, but it's this little girl's father who finds her. I'm just one of those people that thinks sometimes there's this intervention that we can't describe. We just know it was something bigger. And in that moment, it's like everything that needs to collide collides perfectly, and Black is arrested. The worst bit is that Black isn't fazed really. He just talks about the fact that it was a massive rush for him. He loved taking little girls. You know, he loved tying them up because he wanted to make sure he'd got his parcel round dropped off. He even tried to say that he would have let her go. You know, that he just touched her a little, but he hadn't. A doctor said that she'd been subjected to a really serious sexual assault. In fact, the girl was so with it and so able to describe what had happened that she could even tell the police where the sexual assault had occurred. And that also married up with his schedule to where he was going. And undoubtedly, after this, we know he would have abused and killed her. When he gets to the police station, he starts to admit what he's done, and he said he hadn't done more to her because he genuinely didn't have the time. So he's charged at that point with abduction and also severe sexual assault. And at this point, they start recognising there are so many similarities. You know, all these child killings that have occurred seem to corroborate this similar pattern. When he's interviewed, he's not very engaging. He's basically monosyllabic in the interviews. It seems like he knows that he's been caught, but he doesn't really want to engage at all with the police. Forensics looked at his van, and it was horrific what they found. They found restraining devices, they had ropes, sticking plaster, hoods, Polaroid camera, because obviously he liked taking pictures of his victims, pieces of clothing that belonged to girls, a mattress, sexual aids. He basically tried to suggest that he enjoyed a particular type of sexual paraphernalia where he'd put on children's clothes and masturbate in them, and it was purely to enjoy that sexual gratification. It had nothing to do with the horrific and hideous child abuse and murder that was going on. But the police weren't buying any of this. In fact, they searched his property, as expected again by the FBI, massive collection of child pornography, videos, magazines, Polaroids, lots of graphic sexual abuse. And it turned out that this tended to come from Europe, again suggesting that he will have done multiple killings in Europe also. They even found a semen-stained copy of a Nottingham newspaper detailing the 1988 attempted abduction of Teresa Thornhill and a variety of sex aids. One of the things that Black in court freely admitted was that he absolutely had pedophilic preferences. He liked children. He believed that he fought against the urges most of the time, but then at certain points he was unable to. He even agreed that he was a danger to children and that he wished to undergo treatment. With respect, Mr. Black, I think the minute that you have urges that make you genuinely consider that you might want to abduct a child, it's probably the point where you go for help, not after you've murdered several. And like I said, I think that he murdered many more children. I genuinely do. I don't think that there's somebody who is that adept at these kind of abductions and that comfortable at this kind of conscience level is somebody who wouldn't have taken full advantage of doing this in other countries. Imagine being in Europe. What are the chances of them finding him when he's en route in Europe? It would have been perfect, wouldn't it? Perfect opportunities. This is why always being vigilant is so important. You think about that neighbour, Herx. What a hero. He didn't just feel something was off. He made note. He took time. He was vigilant. Without him, Black would probably have got away. One of the things that the psychiatrist said, and I'm just going to say, I don't think we need a psychiatrist to tell us that this guy never, ever, ever needs to be on our streets again. I mean, I think just anyone with a sense of understanding of what makes a normal, happy human would say Black needs to be locked up forever. He's an extreme danger to children. Now, in spite of that, in spite of the fact that he got a full life sentence, of course, as we know, with all of those serial killers, particularly in UK or murderers in the UK, they like to appeal, don't they? They like to say, hey, that's not fair. I've only ended the lives of several children and ruined their families' future, but I think I deserve my freedom. Same with Myra Hindley. Blew my mind. Myra, you definitely needed to die in prison. But for whatever reason, these individuals still think that they have rights that they did not afford their victims. Fortunately, he dropped it, probably because he would have just found that not only did he get exactly the same sentence, they'd probably have added on something else as well, because that's how reprehensible he was, and he is. That 8-year national inquiry culminated in the 1990 arrest of Robert Black. It was one of the longest, it was one of the most exhaustive, it was one of the most expensive of the 20th century. In fact, the weight of evidence, we use that word these days when we think about weight of evidence on computers, the weight of evidence, i.e. how much we've got, but that term comes from the fact that there used to be a weight of evidence. In this case, 22 tonnes. And that inquiry cost £12 million. Now, I don't believe that when you go to prison, you should have anything other than the experience that you expect, which is to have your human rights met, to be kept safe. These are things that we expect in the British prison system. Didn't quite happen for Black though, because one of the big problems that you have is if you're in prison and you're a child molester and killer, you are the lowest of the low. There is a hierarchy in prison, believe me, and it's a very, very specific hierarchy. And it goes from, shall we say, big gang runners being up here, you know, the daddies, so to speak, to child molesters and killers right down here. Women killers just a little bit above that. And if you fall into those categories, you're in for a really, really dark time. He had boiling water thrown over him. It actually had sugar in it because that makes it stick, which means it really causes issues for your skin. He got beaten up constantly. He was stabbed in the head and neck. He was burnt. Even though people who attacked him were given extra years on their own sentence, the chances are that because of those crimes and because around 70% of men who are in jail have been victims of sexual abuse, that's what the statistic is believed to be, you can imagine that when an abuser comes into prison, they have got a lot of rage that they want to take out on those people. One of the things that is really important to note is that Black never admitted any of the killings. Never. You know, he may have admitted guilt, but he never actually talked about the killings in that way. And I think that was very much about him trying to have a level of control. He didn't want people to have power over him. He wanted power for himself. Knowing what he did and not sharing that information means that the story can never fully be told. He doesn't care. He's not concerned about his conscience. He doesn't want to give rest and peace to the families. It's his story that he can replay over again and again in his mind. It's his victims that he can relive, even though he knows that he could at least let the families know what he did, how their lives ended, no matter how painful that is. Believe me, for the victims' families, it's more painful to have the fears of what happened than the reality. The closest that he ever came to actually saying that he had murdered these girls was that when he was asked why he pled guilty, he just said, because I couldn't not. Simple as that. Not I couldn't because I murdered them and this is how, this is why, this is how they died. Just simply because I couldn't go not guilty. Because there was irrefutable evidence, of course, against him. Black isn't with us anymore, which I'm really glad about. He had a heart attack at his prison, 12th of January 2016. He was 68. He was cremated, and guess what? No one came. No one came to his funeral. Not one. Less a pauper's burial, more a prolific paedophile's burial. Who'd want to be there? I also think it's quite fitting that he was cremated, because I imagine that that would have at least got him used to the burning hell that he was going to find himself very, very soon after his death. And it makes me happy to know that not any of his family turned up, because who wants to be that close to evil? You may note that my tone in this particular video is a little bit more aggressive than normal, but child molesters and murderers, I genuinely believe there is only one place that they should be, and it's certainly not on this plane. I hope you'll join me again next week for another episode. I hope that you have found this interesting, and also I hope if you've been triggered by it that you recognise that it's completely normal to feel a level of empathy, compassion, disgust and all the other things that go in between. When covering cases like this, they are shocking, horrific, disgusting. We can all at least go to sleep tonight knowing that this guy is dead, because that does bring me some comfort. And also just to recognise that those poor families who had their babies stolen from them are living a life sentence themselves. If you want to subscribe, please do. You can just click the switch there and I'll be able to be on your screens every Sunday. Remember, if you want to get any health, well-being, fitness or nutrition advice, my free app, Appy Wellbeing, is available on Google and the App Store. And also, more than anything, thanks for listening and see you next week.